recording.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm a senior majoring in MLS, and today I'm going to interview my friend Ruthy about her thesis.
Hi, I'm Ruthy. I'm also a senior in MLS, and I opted to write a senior thesis, and the title of my thesis was Curing Homosexuality, Queerness and Illness in 20th century Western literature.
All right, so to begin, what's the topic of your thesis and what initially interested you in it?
The topic of my thesis is examining the ways in which queerness and illness have been linked historically throughout literature. So looking at kind of the evolution between queerness as a mental health diagnosis up through queerness and the AIDS epidemic, and how different authors and different novelists, I also looked at one play, Tony Kushner's Angels in America, how they have represented these connections and how they have pathologized queerness. And the overarching kind of theme throughout the thesis is trying to identify different cures for these illnesses that have been presented within these texts.
Cool. I guess that kind of leads into the next question, which is like, was there something that like ended up becoming the driving thesis of your work, and like what kind of argument are you making about this time period or text?
So I think it's easiest to explain that I looked at three major texts. So I looked at Virginia Woolf's The Waves, Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, and Tony Kushner's Angels in America, and they were each written in the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s respectively. So it's sort of snapshots at different periods in the 20th century. And I was really looking to see how and if there has been an evolution in the way that queerness was pathologized, but also in the way that cure was posited throughout these texts. So I think that the most interesting aspect of it is that even in like Tony Kushner, who is a gay man, an out gay man writing during the 1980s, where yes, it was the AIDS epidemic, and yes, there was still an incredible amount of stigma surrounding homosexuality. He still fell into the trap of pathologizing queerness, so he still represented queerness as an illness to be cured, and that actually comes from his own personal history. And while doing some research, I unearthed the fact that when he was younger and coming to terms with his own sexuality, he viewed it as something to be cured, and he searched for a cure. And I think that it was interesting how these authors, who all have various backgrounds, like for example, Virginia Woolf is a known queer figure, although during her time she had to be somewhat closeted given the stigma surrounding it, versus Sylvia Plath, who has no historical kind of role in the queer community. There's no evidence to prove that she is a queer figure, up to Tony Kushner, who is an out and one of the most renowned queer playwrights in history. How given their different identities, maybe they produced different connections between queerness and illness, but also how much of that was a product of the time period that they were working in. So I think that, to sum it up, there was, I think, an evolution in what was posited as queerness, as a cure for these connections. In Virginia Woolf's text, the main character at issue is a character named Rhoda, and she is portrayed as a lesbian character. That's never explicitly said. In earlier versions of the text that have been uncovered in Virginia Woolf's letters and writings, so a pre-published version, it's very explicit that she has these homosexual tendencies, versus in the final draft, it's not as apparent, but it's still definitely there. And she's a character who ultimately commits suicide or dies by suicide at the end of the text. And what's very interesting, though, is that throughout the text, Virginia Woolf isn't necessarily, she's not linking Rhoda's sexuality as innately a mental health issue. It's more of the society's inability to accept it that is causing these mental health issues. It's not homosexuality itself that is the issue. And so she's kind of suggesting that a cure it's not the onus of the queer person to find a cure. It's society that needs to be cured of their assumptions and their stereotypes in order to cure the mental health issues that may arise from homosexuality, which is kind of contrasted with what Sylvia Plath is writing about. She's writing in the 50s, and there are a lot of interesting connections between communism and deviant sexuality. And also in the 50s, there was this kind of rise in what's called lesbian pulp fiction, which was these kind of short texts that were like lesbian literature that were very available to the average person. So that's kind of the context in which Sylvia Plath is writing. But in the 50s, there was a very like direct connection between homosexuality and mental health. It was a diagnosable illness. It was codified. It was very much explicit. So in a way to reflect that, the queer characters in that text are very much pathologized, and the cure is either to die. The most overt lesbian character does die by suicide at the end, or you could avoid that ending by conforming to heteronormative expectations. So the main character Esther, rather than dying by suicide at the end, she ends up with a husband and with children, which suggests that heteronormative recovery is the cure for these mental health issues. The bell jar is also quite interesting in this way because it's not typically associated with queer theory. It's more of it's more typically read as a reflection of sexism and misogyny. So reading with this lens is definitely an interesting and more a different way of reading it. And it has very explicit ties to mental health concerns because a good portion of the book takes place in asylum for women. Those were very popular in the 1950s for women dealing with hysteria, homosexuality, and other kinds of deviant personality behaviors. So that was kind of what Sylvia Plath was positing as the cure. And then what's interesting in Angels in America is that by that time, by the 1980s, homosexuality was no longer officially recognized as a mental illness. It was removed from the American Psychiatric Association's manual. But as we all know, that AIDS and HIV kind of replaced that, and there became an incredible amount of stigma associated with an AIDS diagnosis or an HIV diagnosis because of the associations it had with the queer community. So Tony Kushner is more looking at those connections. And he very much does pathologize queerness in that the queer characters in the text are suffering from AIDS, but he has kind of rejected this framework that to be queer is a death sentence, and he is more so presenting the cure to homosexuality is actually being embracing your identity and living openly rather than hiding it. So in terms of that, there's definitely like a switch coming out in the 1980s, which I think makes sense given Kushner's own identity and given the political nature of the LGBTQ rights movement happening around that time. The year that Tony Kushner was writing his text was also the year that ACT UP AIDS, like the AIDS movement started, and like the beginning of the AIDS quilt. So I think there is a lot of those political ties connected to his text as well.
Yeah, that was really interesting, especially given that like the last two novels that you talked about, like we read in a class together. So it's interesting seeing how you wove that into your thesis. So yeah, I guess for the last question, what are some of the larger implications of your work, and like where do you see this kind of work serving in the field as we move forward?
Yeah, so for my research and for like formulating this thesis, I relied heavily on both queer theory and disability theory. mainly because queer theory allowed me to kind of approach these characters, some of them who were not explicitly coded as queer, or some of them who were out, and trying to find common ground between them, which was kind of difficult. So can you treat a closeted lesbian woman from the 1920s the same as an out man from the 1980s? How does that work? How can you compare the two? So looking at queer theory kind of allowed me to find those common grounds. And also, disability theory deals a lot with problematizing the norm, which I think is an overarching theme in queer theory as well. When you look at Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick, you have a lot of the basis of their arguments are dealing with stigma and closeting, and all that has to do with the idea of a norm. So disability theory sort of gave me that kind of ground to stand on when you're talking about stigma, which is very much a part of this thesis, and how stigma drives the narratives behind these queer works from the 20th century. But looking forward, I mentioned this in my conclusion a little bit, is that even the idea of a cure is becoming kind of problematized by a lot of prominent disability theorists, because it's assuming that we need to everyone needs to revert to the normal, which is not necessarily true. So I think kind of going forward, like seeing how maybe texts moving on into the 21st century have dealt with these issues differently, if they reflect more of that kind of even rejecting the pathologizing of queerness and rejecting the notion that there is a cure, because for many people who are involved in this scholarly work, the idea of a cure is one that erases the cultural significance of having the stigma, of having a disability, of having a different identity, and that wasn't the goal of the paper. The goal of the paper was kind of to examine how different societal expectations and potentially and societal expectations and how the implications of queerness have informed literature, and how we can understand how that has kind of how we can view that evolution throughout literature. And it's not necessarily an agreement that the fundamental conception of queerness as illness and the fact that there's a cure has any ground to stand on. It's more of like, what does this say about society? So I think kind of moving forward, how does more modern literature reflect how society's changed? If it does, or are we still falling into the same traps that we have been since the 1920s? And if that's true, like how do we reconcile that with growing queer acceptance, and through the growing queer movement? How do we have that kind of reflect in our works of art?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time. This is really fascinating to hear about, and congratulations.
Thank you, Jess. Congratulations to you as well.
All right.